Doomscrolling. The brain cannot distinguish between a real threat and a vividly described one. Reading about disasters, conflicts, or economic collapse triggers the same cortisol response as if those events were happening directly outside your window. Social media algorithms are specifically designed to surface emotionally activating content because that content drives the most engagement, which means a 20-minute scroll can produce a cortisol profile that resembles mild but sustained exposure to actual danger. People often feel inexplicably worse after being on their phone without being able to explain why. The biology explains it perfectly. Caffeine timing. Caffeine itself is not the main problem here. The timing is. Cortisol peaks naturally in the first hour or two after waking, which is when the body is already at its most alert state on its own. Drinking coffee during that window is essentially pouring fuel on a fire that was already burning. The brain responds over time by down-regulating its own cortisol production, which is one of the real reasons habitual coffee drinkers need more and more caffeine to feel the same effect. The ideal window for that first cup is roughly 90 minutes after waking. Almost nobody does this, which means most regular coffee drinkers are quietly running a dysregulated cortisol pattern before they even leave the house. Your morning phone habit. Most people reach for their phone within the first minute of waking up. It feels harmless. It is the opposite. The moment the brain sees notifications, social comparisons, or just the visual chaos of a full screen, it interprets that as a threat signal before the body has even finished waking up. Cortisol gets hijacked and pushed higher than it needs to go. The day starts in a state of low-grade alarm before a single real event has occurred. Most people never connect the mid-morning anxiety to something they did before they got out of bed. Artificial light at night. The body's cortisol rhythm depends almost entirely on light to stay calibrated. Morning light tells the system to rise, evening darkness tells it to fall. Screens and LED lighting after sunset send a conflicting signal, keeping cortisol elevated at exactly the time it should be dropping toward its lowest point. Fun fact, just 2 hours of screen exposure before bed can shift the body's internal clock by up to 3 hours, meaning your biology genuinely believes it is still afternoon long after midnight. The cortisol pattern follows that confusion without you ever noticing. Skipping meals. The body treats low blood sugar like an emergency because for most of human history it was one. When meals are delayed or skipped, cortisol is released to pull stored glucose into the bloodstream and stabilize it. This happens whether or not the person feels hungry, and it can repeat several times a day in someone who eats irregularly. The pattern is most common in people who skip breakfast, work through lunch, and eat most of their calories at night, which is also the schedule that keeps cortisol cycling upward throughout the day and then asks the body to digest a large meal when it is least equipped to do so. Loneliness. The human nervous system evolved in group settings where isolation meant danger, and it still responds to social disconnection that way. Chronic loneliness produces measurably higher baseline cortisol and a slower return to normal after stress. The effect is dose dependent. The more isolated someone feels, the more pronounced the dysregulation. What makes this particularly striking is that reported loneliness has reached record levels in multiple countries simultaneously. The body is running a survival alarm in response to a social condition, not a physical one, and it genuinely cannot tell the difference. Unresolved conflict. The brain holds onto interpersonal tension in a way that keeps the stress response partially active even hours after the conversation ended. An argument that finished at noon, a difficult email left unanswered, a relationship with resentment quietly sitting underneath it. All of these keep cortisol slightly elevated because the brain has flagged the situation as unresolved and potentially dangerous. Studies measuring cortisol in couples found that those with ongoing unresolved conflicts showed significantly higher levels throughout the entire day compared to couples who communicated openly. The body responds to a difficult relationship the same way it responds to a physical threat. Noise pollution. Chronic background noise is one of the least discussed but most consistent environmental drivers of elevated cortisol. The auditory system is wired directly into the brain's threat detection centers and does not fully habituate to noise the way other senses do. Fun fact, studies on people living near busy airports found measurably higher cortisol and elevated blood pressure even in individuals who reported feeling completely used to the noise. The brain was still responding to it below the level of conscious awareness, running a quiet alarm that never fully switched off. The body hears everything even when the mind has decided to ignore it. Perfectionism. This one is less about what you do and more about how the brain appraises everything you do. Perfectionism keeps the stress response in chronic low-level activation because the brain consistently reads the gap between where things are and where they should be as a form of threat. Research comparing cortisol profiles in high and low perfectionism individuals found that perfectionists not only had higher baseline cortisol, but also took significantly longer to recover after acute stress. The system has trouble standing down because the standard keeps moving. It is like trying to turn off a fire alarm in a house where someone keeps lighting small fires just to see if the alarm still works. Cushing syndrome. This is the extreme end of the spectrum, and it is worth knowing about because it shows what happens when the cortisol system loses the ability to regulate itself entirely. It is usually caused by a tumor in the pituitary or adrenal glands, and the symptoms are essentially everything excess cortisol does at full volume: weight gain in the face and abdomen, muscle wasting, easy bruising, and crushing fatigue. The facial rounding that the internet rebranded as cortisol face is actually a real clinical sign of this condition, and it requires a doctor, not a wellness drink. Mistaking a serious hormonal disorder for a lifestyle problem is exactly how it goes, undiagnosed for years.